It was a very easy production and a lot of fun. We had lots of laughs while we were making it.
It was wonderfully conceived, and it was brilliantly written, and it was executed, I think, in a way that's you don't see anymore.
To remember being 9 years old and seeing all this equipment and electrical things going off all over in circles and bangs, and then I'm the doctor, and it's all happening again. I took a yellow legal pad and a blue felt pen, and I wrote down on top, Young Frankenstein. I didn't know what it meant then. And I went upstairs just to muse for a little while. And for maybe half an hour, I put down what I thought might happen to me if I were the great-grandson of Beaufort von Frankenstein. And I asked myself then, why did you say young Frankenstein? And I think it was because I was influenced by young Edison that I saw as a little boy. Why Frankenstein? Because when I was a little boy, I was scared to death of Frankenstein movies. The original one, and Bride of Frankenstein. I was influenced by Ghost of Frankenstein and Son of Frankenstein, and a little bit of Return of Frankenstein. But mostly, the biggest one was The Bride of Frankenstein. I knew it was fertile ground to do a satire, but I also wanted to have it end my way and not the way it did in the movie. And, originally when I wrote it, I had Dr. Frankenstein being thrown off the precipice and the monster and my fiancée getting together. About 3 months later, my new agent, Mike Medavoy, he said, how about a film with you and Marty Feldman and Peter Boyle? I said, that's great. What made you think of that? He said, because I now represent you and Marty and Peter. I said, well, with a wonderful artistic basis like that, it can't go wrong. And I said, actually, I do have something that might be right. He said, send it to me. I said, give me a little time. I want to work on it. And I took 2 days, and I wrote out 4 pages. The Transylvania station scene where I meet Marty is just about verbatim the way it is in the film now. 2 days later, he calls up, said, terrific, terrific. Maybe we can get Mel Brooks to direct this. I said, I don't think Mel will direct anything that he didn't conceive of. But if you can, it would be wonderful. The next day, Mel calls and says, what are you getting me into? I said, nothing that you don't want to get into. I don't know. I was
having lunch with an agent, Mike Medavoy, at the time, and he told me that he received a treatment from a client of his, Gene Wilder, on a spoof on Frankenstein. And he said, would you like to see it? I went up to his office. I read it. It was only like 12 pages and loved it. We called Gene. We agreed on the type of movie that he was going to write and said he would like to have Mel Brooks go write it.
He was preparing Blazing Saddles. It hadn't come out yet. So when they offered him Young Frankenstein, and I would be doing the writing and he would supervise, it was very tempting, and he said yes. And Columbia had this thing that the budget was $2,250,000, and they said $1,750,000 and not a penny more. And Mel said to them on one historic day, you guys are crackerjacks. You're right down to the penny. So I guess we have to compromise and you have to compromise, so let's meet at $2 million.
Well, the budget came in and it was 2.3, and Mel said, I can't make it for any less than 2.3. And I said, fine, then let's look elsewhere. Columbia doesn't want to do it. And I gave it to a friend of mine who had been starting at 20th Century Fox, Alan Ladd Jr., and he said, great, we'll make this movie. And so I shifted the project from Columbia to Fox.
Mel and I met in my apartment in New York for about 2 hours and 45 minutes on this first day to do with Young Frankenstein. And the first hour was spent with how to make the coffee, what kind of coffee, what to have with the coffee. He had brought a bag of Schnecken, which figures prominently later on in Young Frankenstein in the script. We talked about everything but the script. And after we'd had our talk about all little nothings, which was sort of Mel's way of working, so slowly creep up on whatever you're going to do that's important. We started talking about the script from A to Z, wild things, things that I knew in my heart weren't going to be in, but to touch all the bases.
You know, it was Gene's idea, and once he came up and worked with Gene on the script, he took it over, Mel. And it was a blessing because he's very funny, he's very talented. It allowed us to get the cast that we wanted. It allowed us to get the extra money that we needed to pull this off, his whole vision.
He taught me the greatest screenwriting lesson that I ever had, which was that the first draft is just a concept, and then you have to take a sledgehammer and just knock the pillars as hard as you can. If they hold up, you keep it in. And if they start to crumble, you have to rewrite, because the structure is everything. The blind man pours soup into the monster's soup bowl in The Bride of Frankenstein. I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if he misses and hits the crotch? There was almost an equivalent for each thing that happens. Food, good. Friend, good. It wasn't that we were doing a burlesque. It wasn't the Three Stooges, except the soup came close to that, but it was still in control. And then the cigars and the thumb being lit. It was really a parody of that beautiful scene in The Bride of Frankenstein. I thought it would be a wonderful theatrical experience for the audience to see the monster and me dancing as a test of how far I had, as Dr. Frankenstein, brought the monster along towards sophistication. I thought Mel would burst into tears when he read it, especially Irving Berlin and Top Hat and Tails. And he says, "Are you crazy? What kind of a conceit is this? The audacity? You're going to have all of our work go down the drain with singing and dancing and putting on a show like we're doing some musical?" I was close to rage and tears. I argued the ins and outs of why it was not a conceit, but it was valid. I had turned from red to purple. And right in mid-sentence, Mel says, "Okay, it's in." And I didn't know if he was joking or not. And I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "It's in." Why did you put me through this? And he said, "I wasn't sure if it was right, brilliant and right, or terribly wrong. I didn't know. And I wanted to see how hard you'd fight for it. And I knew if you fought hard enough, it was right. And you did. So it's in." And it was never mentioned again.
I saw it as a possibility for some really great comedy casting. Gene had already had the idea of Peter Boyle for the monster, Marty Feldman for Igor, and Madeline Kahn, and Mel directing, since I had liked his previous films. I thought that we had the potential to make a very funny movie.
Madeline didn't want to play the lab assistant. She wanted to play the fiancé. I thought she must be nuts, because I thought the lab assistant was a much better part. Well, it was until Madeline put her own stamp on my fiancé. Then Terry Garr walked in and read with a German accent the lab assistant, and then that became really a major part. I thought it was a good part, but I didn't know it was going to be such a good part. The monster was great on paper, but we didn't know if it would work. Till Peter came in. I don't know how many people have seen Peter in real life, but he is so childlike, so innocent. You know, he doesn't say words for about an hour and 25, 30 minutes. But he started doing the catching butterflies. That was his idea, to catch butterflies. It brought the part to life. I think that this cast was blessed in a way, I don't say blessed by God, but blessed by something, because everyone found themselves. Frau Blucher was a good part, a crazy lady, but when Cloris Leachman brought the reality to it, she was tutti frutti. I wanted the audience to know that even though they don't know why yet, the horses know that this is a terrifying woman, and God knows what she does to them when no one's watching.
Marty was just the sweetest man. He was just a lovely, cooperative, funny, talented comedy genius. What he brought was his interpretation of those old Frankenstein, Dracula, monster movies, and his interpretation of Igor.
For me, he is probably the heart and soul of the film. The bizarre world that we all entered into when we walked onto that set was epitomized by Marty Feldman. Now, Gene Hackman asked me privately, because I knew him, is there some little part that I could play? He meant like the second officer or something, you know, just to walk through, say a line, and go out. I said, well, I'll talk to Mel, we'll see. We were in pre-production then. I talked to Mel about it. We both agreed that there was only one part, and that was the blind man.
When Gene Hackman's name came up, you heard people say, oh, I knew it was Gene Hackman, or I didn't know who it was. It was, to me, that was a real surprise that people did not realize who it was during the show. And then afterwards, they got a big laugh on the roll-up, knowing who it was, heightened that bit.
Kenny Mars brought an insanity to Inspector Kemp that had to be listened to, adjusted to, as far as the script was concerned.
My thought was that it should begin in black and white to replicate the original original Frankenstein, but that we could segue into color when it became the modern day or the young Frankenstein.
Doing it in black and white was a big thing because no studios around that time were making films in black and white. In fact, we were pressured to make it in color because they said they wouldn't buy black and white films in Europe.
20th Century Fox, who was releasing the picture, weren't very happy about it. They wanted it to be shot in color because they were thinking of the sale to television. And Mel was very adamant about the fact that if they were going to do it in color, he wasn't going to direct it.
But we stuck by our guns and we said, no, this is how we want to make it. This is the vision behind the film. And they said, okay, go ahead.
As I viewed the dailies, though, the first couple of weeks, I realized that Mel was really right. There was a quality of the black and white that really supported the story. And he was 100% correct in doing it. Mel and Gene both had me look at the original Frankenstein and the Bride of Frankenstein. And I was going to replicate this look for them. And that's what I started to do until after about the first week and a half, Mel took me, after the dailies, he said, stay a minute, I want to talk to you. And he said, you know, what did you think of the dailies? I said, well, I thought they would look pretty fine. I said, there were one or two shots that maybe could have been printed a little darker. He said, well, it's not what we want at all. And I was shocked, and I was wondering, what are you saying? He said, we want to satirize that look. We really want it to be more than the original. And I said, well, you never told me that. And fortunately, Gene Wilder was there, and he said, Mel, you know, he's right. We never spoke to him about we wanted to do more. We wanted to satirize the look. He said, he's replicating the look, but we want it to be more so. So I told him, I said, well, we were doing night photography then. I said, I'll try several things tonight and see if you like it better. And I did several things, and the dailies would come up, and the first scene comes on. He said, that's more like it. And then another couple came on, and I changed things a little bit. Oh, that's even better. And finally, we came to an understanding. The other thing I did was to have the lab process the film in a specific way that supported the look that I wanted. And this was a problem because at this particular point in time, the labs hadn't done any black and white films for some time, 6 or 8 years. Mel, being the comedic director that he was and having worked in comedy all his career, I guess, at that time, was that he felt comedy should be bright. I guess must have been about 3 weeks later, Mel said to me, he said, you know, I'm glad I didn't fire you 3 weeks ago. And I felt like saying, you should be lucky I didn't leave the picture. I remember going along with Mel on a scouting trip, and we went to Strickfaden's garage, and all the equipment was sitting on there from the original Frankenstein, and I just looked at this in awe and wonder and amazement. And he came on the set whenever we were doing the lab. He was there all the time, and not only did he bring his old equipment and keep it running properly, but he was designing new things at the same time.
You know, I had a lot of sense memories from having seen it in the original films when I was a kid. And I wondered what would happen when I was actually playing with it as the doctor. And to see it in the lab, it was hard not to smile.
Dale Hennessy put up beautiful sets. They were some of the most beautiful sets I ever worked on.
In the best of worlds, the production designer is a part of the script, if they can bring the script to life. But it was as if he was doing his part in writing the script, because some of the scenes were actually better because of his concept of what it looked like. It was a mammoth set. When you walked in, the ceilings were like 30 feet high. It was just huge, and everything was solid.
We shot it on the lot at Fox. We used, for the exteriors, we used the back lot of MGM and for Transylvania Station and a number of other scenes.
The bedrooms were fantastic. The revolving bookcases. And what Jerry Hirschfeld did in the lighting of Dale Hennessy's sets was it was like another writer working on it, walking down that staircase after having found the secret passageway. It was pretty simple, just spraying cobwebs all over the place, but the way it was lit, and I had a candle with a light in it, shining for my face and Terry's face, and it was spooky. The little room, the library, the secret library, finding the notebooks of Victor Frankenstein. 10 designers would have, of course, done it 10 different ways, but this designer, Dale Hennessy, and this director of photography, Jerry Hirschfeld, were completely in tune with what the script was about, which was not how can we make fun, but how can we make it real, which will make it more fun. When Mel would just pull lightly on the reins for Madeline or me or Cloris, if he wasn't getting what he wanted, he would start tugging. And Marty didn't respond well to the tugging. I don't mean that there was anger or fights or anything like that, but as soon as the reins were loosened, Marty would respond like anyone with freedom. Now, that means that maybe he would go off half-cocked in the wrong direction, but the next take, he'd go off full-cocked in the right direction.
My really personal feeling about Mel is that he is a consummate comedic director. I haven't worked with anybody that has his talent. Once I can detach myself from watching my lighting on a take, I'm watching the performance. And I'd see a performance, let's say it was with the Monster and Dr. Frankenstein, and I said, geez, that's awfully good. And Mel would say, let's do it again. Gee, that looked perfect to me. But the next take was even better. I don't know what he would say to the actors. He'd walk up to them and speak to them, and it was his expertise. And sometimes this would go on for 2, 3, or 4 takes, and each one got better and better.
What begins as a joke doesn't necessarily end up being what's on the screen. You have to baby it, and you have to try it many different ways. And it may seem funny to you one way if it's just a character reading it on camera and it's hysterical, but you have to integrate it with the things that are around it and finding the balance for that.
We knew we were getting what we wanted. We were getting beyond what we wanted, because after every take, there'd be laughter and, it was just gelling. It's when you work with an ensemble cast like that and it gels, it's marvelous.
I think this was Mel's most brilliant day, but Madeline Kahn arrives, my fiancée. Mel improvised this on the spot, and Marty says, okay, you take the blonde, I'll take the one in the toy bin. How it came to toy bin, I don't know. You take the blonde, I'll take the one in the toy bin, and Mel told him to bite the head of the fox fur that she was wearing. It took, I would say, conservatively, 8 or 9 takes, because every time he bit the fur, there was always fur left in his mouth. And we couldn't not laugh. I tried. After the first or second, I said, well, what do you expect? But the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, we finally did, as I say, either the 8th or 9th, and I held it. It took great moral strength. I held on. It looked as if maybe I was holding back some kind of anger at him, but it really was holding back the quivering mouth from not wanting to laugh. We all laughed, and Marty was so funny doing it.
I had a problem with my camera operator. It wasn't a bad problem, it was a good problem. And the problem was that there was so much hilarity. I mean, what was going on was so funny that he'd sit on the camera and he'd start laughing. And in laughing, he would shake the camera.
It was a great ensemble piece, no problem whatsoever. They were all laughing their way through this film. It was Terry's, first real film. There was no problem on this movie at all. The only problem was I had to stay out, away from the set because I was laughing too much during the filming of the piece.
They're up on the roof, and the lightning is flashing in the sky, and this big electrode is arcing to the body, and they cut to a close-up of the head. And a lot of people have wondered, but they know that it wasn't Peter Boyle because the head begins to glow. We begin to see the teeth, the skeleton. All the, they said, how was that created? It was a model had been made of Peter Boyle's head. And Bill Tuttle, who was the makeup artist and created the whole design for the monster, had replicated his head in plastic. And inside he had, by some magic, put rows of teeth and a little brain tissue and whatnot, and a light. And we just brought that light up on a dimmer, and the head would glow, and we'd take it down, and it would unglow, and it was pulsing, in other words. And it was a highlight of the creation.
It was at one point, I think we were doing a temp dub, and he was doing the scene with Kenny Mars with the dart game, and he kept throwing the darts out the window because he'd give him a shot every time the gene was up throwing a dart. And Mel felt that the timing started to get a little dull at that point, and it was just a simple thing. And you actually hear it in the film now when I think it's on the third throw. He throws it out the window, and you hear this, and of course it was Mel. That's actually Mel's voice.
The monster sits on the seesaw, and he sits down. And of course, there again is another close-up gag line because she says, "Let's do a seesaw," and he's about to get on there, and he looks right into the camera, and that expression alone sets up the gag. And he sits down, and of course, the girl flies through the air. Well, these days it would be done. You could do it digitally and electronically on a computer, but at that time we had actually put a cable on the young lady and fly her through the air. And the problem is not to be able to see that cable because there's no retouching. And that becomes a trick in itself. And it's done through lighting and through doing little painting dabs on the cable and making sure the background it's against is not going to make it stand out.
What we would do is assemble a reel. He would go around and invite all these secretaries from the lot to come down to the theater and run it. He'd go around a lot and say, "Can you come to a movie? Can you come and see a reel or two and listen to the laughs and rework the reel?"
He really pioneered that.
Yeah.
Because he didn't want studio executives.
Exactly.
He wanted people that as close to being off the street as he could on short-term notice.
I would see things in the first screening that I didn't think Mel would want in the final, but he's the director. And I'd say, he said, I know, but let me try it out again to see if the audience, and we'd have a second screening with secretaries and butchers and bakers and candlestick makers to see what the reaction was.
Sometimes an audience is on top of a joke before you know it. You think you're telling it well, but the fact of the matter is they know it's coming.
Whether it's comedy or it's just dialogue, it's the beats before the line, the laugh, frames. I'm talking about a few frames added can change the whole feel of it. Editors went to previews. People went out and sat in the audience and felt the audience more so than today where people go through, psychologists come in and give people forms and this is what people wrote down, so this is what it means. That you really learned how to feel an audience, and if they're getting bored in the story, you look 10 minutes prior to that, not right where they're getting bored.
As the writer, I saw, what are you doing to my script? As a director in an embryo state, I said, I understand that he's thinking of the whole picture, not just this scene, but what kind of a movie is it going to be?
It so often happens when you're going to your first preview. At the end, the director and everybody, they want to get air out. They want to make sure everything's playing quickly, and there becomes this panic, about is the movie going to be perceived as being slow and dull. And Mel was starting to take out some gags, and at one point he said, well, we're going to take out the gag at the railroad station in Transylvania where Marty says to Gene, walk this way. And Stan said, no, please don't do that, please. And Mel said, no, it's coming out, it's coming out. It's a cheap joke. And Stan said, yeah, it's a cheap joke, but it's funny. Please don't take it out. So finally, Mel relented and said, okay, it'll stay for the preview, but it's coming out Saturday. That scene came on, the audience howled. And we came up to Mel afterwards out on the sidewalk. We said, all right, so do we take it out tomorrow? And he said, get out of here.
Before the wrap party, he fought with the heads of studios and everything. And he had every cast member and everybody walk out of this. They were shooting up stairs and come down.
Stairs.
We were going to end the movie with it. He said he had to have that shot.
For end titles.
For end titles. I don't think it ever went in the show anyway. But he got that. And I don't know what it was, but I know it was a big fight, but he went out. And that's how they all walked down. We started the wrap party from there.
Well, we had some previews, so we knew that people really liked the film. There was no doubt in our mind that people liked it, but you never know, until the day the film opens. The public is going to come to see it. We opened it up around Christmas time in '74, and there were a lot of very big movies. And so the competition was going to be really, really tough. And there we were, doing business like Blazing Saddles, which was also a big hit. So because of those two films, Mel became a major player in town. And prior to Blazing Saddles, he couldn't get arrested for 3 years.
I happen to have a very close personal friend who's got 2 children. At the time, they are now in their teens, but at the time they were about 8, 10, or 12, or something like that. They bought a tape of Young Frankenstein, a videotape, and wore it out. They knew the lines. They knew all the gag lines.
People that I meet, and they say, well, you did that movie. God, it's... And they start giving me lines from the film.
It just seemed that everything was there. And there were so few things in that film that were forced. I mean, it really was basically all there. It was trimmed down, and some things were deleted, but that it was all there. There were no big reshoots like there are today. They hit it.
I think it's the best thing Mel did as a filmmaker, not just as a comedian or comedy. I think it's a total film.
I think the thing that makes Frankenstein live, a creature, disformed, who has love in his heart, wants to be loved, and is misunderstood. And even though we were doing a comedy, a ridiculous comedy, that classic theme is still there. And I think that's why it lives.